A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at a map of the Caribbean the other day, and it is a complete mess of colors if you are trying to track who actually owns what. You've got independent nations, but then you've got these tiny specks that are technically part of France, or the United Kingdom, or the United States. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the pragmatic reality of these overseas dependencies. He is asking what it actually means to be a non-sovereign territory in 2026, and how these idyllic islands ended up in this legal limbo in the first place.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I love this because it forces us to look at the world map not as a collection of finished products, but as a series of ongoing legal experiments. Most people think of the world as being divided into 200 or so independent countries, and that is it. But if you look at the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories, there are 17 of them left that the UN officially monitors. But pragmatically, there are dozens more if you count the ones that have reached a level of integration where they are no longer considered colonies. It is the paradox of the paradise dependency. You have these places with incredibly high qualities of life, often much higher than their independent neighbors, but they have very limited political agency on the world stage.
It is a spectrum, right? It is not just a binary choice between being a colony or being independent. You've got different flavors of this relationship that seem to change depending on which empire left the lights on.
It is a huge spectrum. On one end, you have the French model. Places like Guadeloupe, Martinique, and French Guiana are not just territories. They are overseas departments of France. They are as much a part of France as Paris is. They use the euro. They vote in European Parliament elections, and their citizens have full French rights. They even have representatives in the French National Assembly. Then you have the British model with the 14 British overseas territories like Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. They are mostly self-governing when it comes to local laws, but the United Kingdom handles their defense and international relations. They are not part of the United Kingdom, but they are under its sovereignty.
And the United States has its own version, with places like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the United States Virgin Islands. They are U.S. soil, but they are unincorporated, which leads to that weird situation where they are citizens, but cannot vote for the president in the general election. It feels like a very intentional choice by these territories to stay in this middle ground. Why is that? Why not just go for full independence and get that seat at the United Nations?
Because for many of these islands, sovereignty is a massive overhead cost that they simply cannot afford or do not want to bear. When you are a small island nation with a population of 50,000 people, the cost of maintaining a standing army, a diplomatic corps, a central bank, and a national currency is astronomical. By remaining a dependency, you essentially outsource the most expensive parts of statehood to a superpower or a major European power. You get the protection of the United States Navy or the British Royal Air Force for free. It is what we call the strategic asset model.
So it is a trade-off. You give up a bit of your political agency at the highest level in exchange for a massive safety net and high-level infrastructure. I imagine the passport alone is a huge factor for the individual citizens.
The passport is everything. If you are from Bermuda, you hold a British passport. That gives you the right to live and work in the United Kingdom and, depending on the current treaties, easier access to the rest of the world than if you held a passport from a tiny, newly independent microstate. But the real meat of this discussion is how we got here. Most of these places are the leftovers of the great colonial empires, but they are the leftovers that refuse to leave because the alternative was often economic collapse or geopolitical irrelevance.
That is an interesting way to put it. During the decolonization waves of the 1950s and 60s, most of the big landmasses in Africa and Asia fought for or negotiated their independence. Why did these islands stay behind? Was it just the size?
In many cases, it was a matter of survival. Take the Pitcairn Islands. It has a population of about 50 people. How does a population of 50 maintain a sovereign state? They cannot. They do not have a hospital that can perform major surgery. They do not have a high school. They rely entirely on the United Kingdom for those services. But then look at the other end of the scale with French Polynesia. They have nearly 300,000 people and a massive degree of autonomy. They have their own president and their own assembly that can pass local laws called lois de pays. Yet, they remain part of France because the French state provides billions of euros in subsidies every year. If they went independent tomorrow, their economy would essentially vanish.
So it is a subsidized existence. But what does the parent nation get out of it? Surely France and the United Kingdom are not just doing this out of the goodness of their hearts.
Absolutely not. These islands are what military planners call unsinkable aircraft carriers. We talked about this a bit in episode 830 when we looked at United States military bases. If you are the United States or the United Kingdom, having a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific or the Indian Ocean is worth more than its weight in gold for signal intelligence and power projection. Look at the Chagos Islands, specifically Diego Garcia. The United Kingdom recently reached a deal in late 2024 to hand sovereignty of the archipelago to Mauritius, but they specifically carved out a 99-year lease for the military base on Diego Garcia. That is the pragmatic reality. The sovereignty can change hands on paper, but the strategic utility is what the big powers actually care about.
So the parent nation has a huge incentive to keep the relationship going because of the strategic depth it provides. It is not just about the land, it is about the water around it. You mentioned the exclusive economic zones earlier.
The water is the secret. Under the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a country gets an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, that extends 200 nautical miles from its coast. If you own a tiny speck of an island in the middle of the ocean, you suddenly own the fishing rights and the mineral rights to over 125,000 square miles of ocean. For a country like France, their overseas territories make them the owner of the second largest maritime domain in the world, totaling over 11 million square kilometers. That is more than the United States or Russia. Most of that is thanks to tiny islands in the Pacific and Indian Oceans.
That is a staggering amount of resources for a country that is geographically located in Europe. But what does this look like for the people living there? If I'm living in the Cayman Islands, how much does the British government actually interfere with my day-to-day life?
Very little usually. This is where the concept of associated statehood or autonomous territory comes in. Most of these territories have their own parliaments, their own tax codes, and their own courts for local matters. The parent nation usually only steps in if there is a massive breakdown in the rule of law or a huge financial scandal. For example, the United Kingdom had a major standoff with the British Virgin Islands a few years ago over corruption concerns, where they threatened to impose direct rule from London. It caused a massive diplomatic rift because the local population felt their hard-won autonomy was being snatched back. But most of the time, these territories are functioning as autonomous labs.
And that autonomy leads directly into the other big pragmatic reality of these places. They are often financial hubs. The Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, they have used their unique legal status to become massive players in global finance. How does that work legally?
They have mastered the sovereignty gap. They use the stability and the judicial backstop of the United Kingdom's legal system, specifically the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London as the final court of appeal. This gives international investors huge confidence because they know their contracts are ultimately backed by centuries of British common law. But at the same time, these islands set their own tax rates, which are often zero or near zero for corporations. It is the ultimate regulatory sandbox. You get the prestige and safety of a first world legal system with the flexibility of a small, agile jurisdiction.
It feels like they are selling sovereignty as a service. They are saying, we will give you the protection of the British Crown, but we will not charge you the British tax rate.
That is exactly what it is. They are unbundling the rights of a state. In a traditional country, you get the whole package, the taxes, the military, the laws, the social safety net. In an overseas dependency, they have unbundled those. They take the military and the high court from the parent, but they keep the tax and regulatory power for themselves. This has made some of these territories incredibly wealthy. Bermuda and the Cayman Islands have a higher gross domestic product per capita than the United Kingdom itself. They are not struggling colonies, they are elite financial nodes.
But there is a contrast here, right? Because not all dependencies are rich. You mentioned the United States Virgin Islands versus the British Virgin Islands.
That is a fascinating comparison. The British Virgin Islands, or BVI, are an overseas territory. They have their own tax system and have become a global hub for company and corporations. The United States Virgin Islands, or USVI, are an unincorporated U.S. territory. Because they are more closely tied to the U.S. federal system, they do not have the same flexibility to act as a pure tax haven. They are subject to more federal oversight and different tax rules. As a result, the BVI has a much higher GDP per capita than the USVI. The USVI relies much more on federal grants and tourism, whereas the BVI is a financial engine. It shows that the specific flavor of your dependency matters immensely for your economic outcome.
So the idea that these are all struggling colonies is a total misconception. But there is a flip side to this. Because they are not fully sovereign, they do not have a seat at the table in international organizations. They are not members of the United Nations. They cannot sign treaties on their own. This becomes a massive problem when we talk about things like climate change.
Climate change is the existential threat to this model. If the G7 or the G20 decides to implement a global minimum tax, which we have seen moving forward in 2025 and 2026, these territories do not get a vote. They are just told what the new rules are by their parent nations. But even more critically, these islands are on the front lines of sea level rise. If you are a tiny island dependency and your land is disappearing, you do not have a seat at the COP climate summits to demand reparations or funding. You have to hope your parent nation advocates for you.
They are essentially subject to international laws that they have no hand in drafting. That sounds like a modern version of the old taxation without representation argument.
It is exactly that tension. In the United States, this is the perennial debate with Puerto Rico. They are subject to federal laws. They serve in the military at high rates, but they have no voting representation in Congress and no vote for the president. Pragmatically, they are in a loop where they have enough benefits to make independence look risky, but enough restrictions to make the current status feel like second-class citizenship. There was a lot of talk about a status referendum in 2024, but the political gridlock in Washington usually means these territories stay in limbo because changing their status is a massive constitutional headache.
What about the security aspect? You mentioned the military bases. In a world where global tensions are rising, especially in the Indo-Pacific, these dependencies must be feeling the heat.
They are on the front lines. Look at Guam. It is a massive hub for the United States military in the Pacific. If a conflict breaks out, Guam is a primary target. The residents there are United States citizens, but they are living in a place that is essentially a military fortress. They have to balance the economic benefits of that military presence with the reality that they are a geopolitical bullseye. And again, they have very little say in the high-level defense policy that puts them in that position. They are the literal pillars of Western maritime power, but they are also the most exposed.
It seems like the idyllic island image is a bit of a mask for some very hard-nosed geopolitical and financial realities. How did the legal framework for this actually survive the 20th century? I mean, the UN was very anti-colonial.
The UN's framework for decolonization actually allows for three outcomes. A territory can become an independent state, it can become fully integrated into another state like the French model, or it can enter into a free association with another state. Most of these territories have argued that they have achieved a full measure of self-government through one of these paths. The ones still on the UN list, like American Samoa or the United States Virgin Islands, are there because the UN believes the process is not yet finished or the local population has not had a clear enough say in their final status.
But in many cases, when they do have a vote, they choose to stay. I remember the Falkland Islands had a referendum a few years ago.
In 2013, the Falkland Islands voted on whether to remain a British overseas territory. The turnout was 92%, and 99.8% voted to stay British. Only 3 people voted against it. When you have a neighbor like Argentina claiming your land, the protection of the British military is not a theoretical benefit, it is an existential necessity. Similarly, in New Caledonia, a French territory in the Pacific, there were 3 referendums on independence between 2018 and 2021. All 3 rejected independence, though the last one was boycotted by pro-independence groups. The tension there boiled over into significant unrest in 2024, showing that even when people vote to stay, the underlying desire for more agency never really goes away.
So it really comes down to pragmatism over pride. Full sovereignty sounds great in a textbook, but if it means losing your security, your passport, and your economic niche, it is a hard sell.
And let's talk about the economic niche more, because this is where it gets really interesting for the future. We are seeing these territories move beyond just being tax havens. They are becoming hubs for things like satellite tracking, deep sea mining exploration, and even cryptocurrency regulation. Because they can move faster than a giant bureaucracy like the United States or the European Union, they can set up legal frameworks for new technologies in months rather than years. They are the fast-moving startups of the geopolitical world, while the parent nations are the legacy corporations providing the venture capital and the legal department.
I love that. And like any startup, they are vulnerable. If the legacy corporation decides to change the terms of the deal, the startup is in trouble.
We saw this with the United Kingdom Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act. The UK Parliament forced its overseas territories to create public registers of beneficial ownership for companies to combat money laundering. The territories fought it, saying it violated their autonomy over local financial matters, but London basically said, "We are the sovereign power and you will do this." That is the sovereignty gap in action. It is a bundle of rights that can be unbundled, but the person who owns the bag can always reach in and take a few rights back if they really want to.
For Daniel's prompt, the pragmatic reality today is that these dependencies are some of the most strategic and economically leveraged places on Earth, precisely because they're not fully independent. They occupy the cracks in the global system and turn those cracks into gold mines.
They really do. And as we move further into the 21st century, I think we are going to see more of these sovereignty experiments, not fewer. As people look for ways to escape high-tax jurisdictions or restrictive regulations, these non-sovereign territories are going to become even more attractive as hubs for innovation and capital. They are the release valves for the global financial and military systems.
But they are also incredibly vulnerable to things they can't control, like sea level rise. If an island becomes uninhabitable due to climate change, who is responsible for moving you?
That is the looming crisis. For the French overseas departments, the answer is legally clear because they are full citizens. For British overseas territories or United States territories, the legal waters are much murkier. You could have a situation where a population has a passport but no land, and the parent nation has to decide how much they really care about a territory that no longer provides a strategic or economic benefit. It brings us back to that idea of sovereignty as a service. If the service is no longer profitable or useful to the provider, the contract might get canceled.
It is a fascinating survival strategy. You stop being a colony by becoming a partner, even if you are the junior partner in the relationship. I think the big takeaway here is that sovereignty isn't a single thing you either have or you don't. It is a bundle of rights, and in 2026, being able to trade some of those rights for security and stability is a very rational choice for a lot of the world's smallest players.
It is the ultimate pragmatic move. You trade the title of king for the lifestyle of a prince who doesn't have to pay for his own castle. For most people, that is a deal they would take any day of the week. It turns the world into a much more interesting place to study. Every one of those tiny dots has a legal story that is just as complex as any major nation.
If you want to dive deeper into how these legal frameworks are built from scratch, you should definitely check out episode 1153, which is our guide to starting your own country. It gives a lot of context on what it actually takes to be recognized as a sovereign state and why so many islands decide it is not worth the hassle.
That was a fun one. It really highlights the difference between having a flag and having a seat at the table. Most of these dependencies have the flag, they have the culture, but they are happy to let someone else handle the table.
And for more on the maritime side of things, check out episode 1196, Sovereign of the Surf, where we talk about international waters and how these EEZs actually work in practice.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We really appreciate you spending your time with us as we dig into these topics.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumintop, for keeping the show running smoothly behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to explore these weird prompts in such depth.
If you are enjoying the show, the best thing you can do is find us on Spotify and hit that follow button. It helps other people find the show and keeps us growing.
We will see you next time for whatever Daniel throws at us. Take it easy.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth.